Hello, my name is Dr. Michael Batu, and today we're going to talk about transfer earnings and economic rent. So what do we mean by transfer earnings? So transfer earnings is the minimum payment required by a factor. So when we say factor, this is like an input or factors of production. In order to prevent it from current use, or rather to prevent it from leaving its current use. I think that's what we meant here, from leaving its current use. So let's have an example here. So for instance, you wish to hire a person, and let's say that person has a very rare talent. So you have to pay that person an amount that, in order that person to be happy to accept that offer. And if the offer that you give to that person is not enough, then that person will just leave and find another job. So that's what we mean by transfer earnings. Economic rent, on the other hand, is the excess of total earnings over transfer earnings. So for instance, again, let's use that example. So if you pay a person so much that you gave that person a bonus on top of the amount that that person is already happy receiving, then that excess amount is what we call economic rent. Now, in the next part of this video, what I'm going to do is we're going to explore transfer earnings and economic rents by way of graphs. All right, so now we have here our graph where we have our demand for this particular factor and the supply for this particular factor. And the point where the demand and supply for this factor intersect is at point E, so that's where we have our equilibrium. And the equilibrium factor price is given by FPE, and the equilibrium amount of this factor is given by QE. Now, what do you notice here is that our supply curve is flat. So what we mean by this is that we have a perfectly elastic labor supply, or perfectly elastic factor. Okay, so let's say it's labor supply. Let's say you want to hire someone, and FPE is like the wage for that person. So the implication of having a perfectly elastic labor supply is this: if you offer this person a slightly lower wage, meaning that you offer this person an amount that's slightly lower than FPE, then this particular individual will not work, will refuse your offer and will go elsewhere. But if you give this person FPE or even higher, this person will accept your offer. And at FPE, of course, this individual is willing to provide QE amounts of labor, if you think it that way. Think of it that way. So another implication is that our factor is extremely mobile. Why? Because if you offer this individual a slightly lower wage, then this person will go elsewhere. And in this case, this rectangle right here, 0, QE, E, FPE, these are all transfer earnings. So mathematically, it's like the area for this rectangle, which is simply QE times FPE. That gives you the area for this rectangle. Now, all of the factor income in this case, so all of the factor income is transfer earnings. Now, what do you think will happen if instead our supply curve for this factor is vertical? So that's what we're going to explore in the next part of this video. All right, so now we have our case here where our factor supply is vertical. So the implication of a vertical factor supply curve is this. So we have a perfectly inelastic labor supply, okay, or factor supply. And what happens here is that the same quantity is supplied whatever the price. So unlike the previous case where we have a perfectly elastic labor supply where that factor is perfectly mobile, in this case it's not. In fact, this factor has very limited use. And this limited use is illustrated by the fact that whatever FP, whatever factor price you offer, you will have the same amount QE regardless of or whatever that factor price is. So in other words, the factor in this case, for instance labor, has no other alternative use. And thus requires no minimum amount or no minimum payment to keep it in its present use. Now, we also have the intermediate case where it's somewhere in between perfectly inelastic and perfectly elastic. And I'm going to illustrate that case here briefly. And before I do that, this area right here, remember in the previous case, it was all transfer earnings. In this case, these are all economic rent. Now, in the intermediate case where supply is somewhere in between perfectly elastic and perfectly inelastic, then you will have an area where it's economic rent and where you have an area where it's purely transfer earnings. And I'm going to sketch that here in the next part. So now we have here a case where our supply curve or our factor supply curve is in the intermediate case or intermediate between a perfectly elastic supply curve and a perfectly inelastic supply curve. So here we have an area which is our economic rent. And also we have a portion here where it's transfer earnings. So this is the case where you have our supply curve somewhere in between elastic and inelastic. So I hope you learned something from this video, and thank you for watching, and see you soon.